Hey everyone, this is the introduction and like the stuff at the beginning of the book for C.L.R. James, a political biography written by Kent Worcester. First, I'm going to look up Kent Worcester. Kent Worcester, born 1959, is an American political scientist, historian, comics critic, and songwriter. Kent Worcester's work deals with popular culture, intellectual history, trade unions, and social democracy. Kent Worcester has written extensively on comics and graphic novels and wrote a biography of C.L.R. James, the West Indian intellectuals, among many other publications. Worcester received his B.A. in economics and political science from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, his M.A. Master Philosophy, and a PhD in Political Science from Columbia University. From 1990 to 2000, Worcester was a program director at the Social Science Research Council, a nonprofit organization that promotes interdisciplinary research in the social sciences. Kent Worcester is currently a professor of political science at Marymount Manhattan College. Kent Worcester is an important contributor to the growing body of critical literature on comics and graphic novels. Kent Worcester's writings place particular emphasis on their social and political impact and subtext. Worcester has been contributing to the Comics Journal, print and web versions since 1993, and was a blogger for TCJ.com from 2008 to 2010. Kent Worcester co-edited A Comic Studies Reader in 2008 with Jeet Heer. The book received the Peter C. Rollins Book Award in 2009 for its contribution to popular culture and American studies. Worcester, Heer, and Charles Hatfield co-edited the Superhero Reader 2013, which is nominated for an Eisner Award of Best Academic Scholarly Work in 2014. Worcester is the author of C.L.R. James, a Political Biography, published in 1996, which was part of a resurgence of scholarly interest in the life and work of the Caribbean writer, socialist, and anti-colonial activist. Other works by Kent Worcester include studies of trade union responses to neoliberal economic restructuring from the 1970s to the 1990s in Britain, the United States, and Europe. Kent Worcester wrote a history of the Social Science Research Council, which was commissioned by then-President Kenneth Pruitt for the organization's 75th anniversary in 2001. Worcester edited a collection of essays for the American Political Science Association, Navigating Political Science, in 2018, which deals with professional concerns in the field and with theoretical and methodological questions. In the 1980s, Worcester was a songwriter, singer, and rhythm guitarist for the satirical rock band The Dog's Breakfast. He wrote the songs Changes, Father Song, New York, and Paul is Dead for the group's album Beautiful Banality. Worcester contributed several songs to recordings by guitarist and songwriter Matt Backer. The song Landlocked for the album Is That All, released in 2001. The song Impulse Man, Oh No Don't Cry, and Once in a While for the album The Impulse Man, released in 2006. The song Assiduous Polygamy and I'm No Fool for the album Idle Hands 2012. In 2019, Kent Worcester released a self-produced EP, That's Why I Surf, and another in 2021, A Million Candles, both on Bandcamp. In 2020, the independent music website Divide and Conquer interviewed Kent Worcester about his music, his work with Backer and The Dog's Breakfast, and the connections between comics and popular music. In a 2022 review of Worcester's most recent release, Soviet America, Jamie Funk describes Worcester's entire Bandcamp output as, quote, pure and genuine. His books include Trade Union Politics, American Unions and Economic Change, 1960s to 1990s, published in 1995. C.L.R. James, A Political Biography, published in 1996. Violence and Politics, Globalization's Paradox, published in 2000. Co-edited with Sally Avery, Bermanzone, and Mark Ungar. The Social Science Research Council, 1923 to 1998, published in 2001. Arguing Comics, Literary Masters on a Popular Medium, 2004. A Comic Studies Reader, 2008, co-edited with Jeet Heer. The Superhero Reader, published in 2013, co-edited with Charles Hatfield and Jeet Heer. Silent Agitators, cartoon art from the pages of New Politics, published in 2016. As a side note, Kent Worcester is currently, I know this, or is about to release a book with the Historical Materialism book series, which is a collection of works by Julius and Phyllis Jacobson, who were the representatives, in addition to, along with Hal Draper, of Third Camp Socialism in the United States, or Third Camp Trotskyism. Third Camp Socialism might be a better term. What was I going to say? And they were the editors. They put together the journal New Politics, which put some of the releases some of the best political commentary, I think. Peter Baga, Conversations, published in 2016. Peter Cooper, Conversations, 2018. Navigating Political Science, Professional Advancement and Success in the Discipline, published in 2018. From MORI to Magna Carta, The Selected Writings of Sir Robert Worcester, Volumes 1 and 2, published between 2021 and 2022. Pi Sigma Alpha, A Centennial History, published in 2022. A Cultural History of the Punisher, Marvel Comics and the Politics of Vengeance, published in 2023 with University of Chicago Press. Okay, so that's who Kent Worcester is. The table of contents for the C.L.R. James, A Political Biography include Part 1, which has the chapters Beyond a Boundary and Modern Politics. Part 2, which has 3 chapters, Education, Propaganda, Agitation, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, Facing Reality. Part 3 has 2 chapters, Parties and Politics in the West Indies, and At the Rendezvous. Then there's an appendix of abbreviations, a glossary of names, selected and annotated bibliography of the secondary literature, and then notes. Acknowledgements. My aim in writing this book is to have produced an accessible, empirically grounded account of C.L.R. James's remarkable life, one that affirms James's relevance for the contemporary world and contemporary politics. In attempting to carry out this relatively broad agenda, I have been fortunate to be able to count on the assistance of a wide array of institutions and individuals. First of all, for their assistance with this project, I'd like to thank the librarians of the Archives of Labor History and Urban Affairs at the Walter Reuter Library at Wayne State University, Butler Library and Rare Books Collections at Columbia University, the C.L.R. James Institute in New York, the Houghton and Widener Libraries at Harvard University, New York Public Library, the Newspaper Library of the British Library, Collindale, the Prometheus Research Library in New York, the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York, the Tamiment Institute Library in New York, the Trinidad and Tobago National Archive, the Trinidad Public Library, the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. I would also like to extend my thanks to the administrative and library staff at Queen's Royal College in Port of Spain, as well as Jorge Jaina and the Centro de Investigaciones del Caribe y América Latina at the Universidad Interamericana de Puerto Rico. A number of helpful individuals assisted me in locating interviews, manuscripts, photographs, old buildings, and other documentary materials relevant to this project. In this context, I would especially like to thank William Carr, Diane Feely, Martin Glaberman, Louis Homer, Phyllis Jacobson, as I said, Alan Mackenzie, E. Ethelbert Miller, Mackey and Dexter, Hugh Morrison, Courtney Quinton, Jean Tussey, Alan Wald, and James D. Young. Special mention must go to Bill French, whose University Place bookshop houses a remarkable collection of first edition and other valuable books on the African diaspora. I've also benefited from conversations and correspondence with individuals working in related fields of inquiry, especially John Agnew, Stanley Aronowitz, Tony Bouges, Bridget Bray-Retton, David Ames Curtis. If you don't know who David Ames Curtis is, David Ames Curtis edited the volume on the collected works, political writings, at the very least. I think he might have edited a couple other volumes of his work, but is the editor of and translator of a lot of works of Cornelius Castoriadis, Selwyn Cudjoe, Ralph Dumaine, Anna Grimshaw, Stephen Hastings King. If you don't know who Stephen Hastings King is, Stephen Hastings King published a big fat book on the relation. I think it's primarily about like workers' inquiry within the Socialisme au Barbarie group and journal. Paul LeBlanc, an important American Trotskyist, Jack Spence, Kenneth Serin, Roderick Thurton, and Richard Williams. Other individuals who offered advice and encouragement along the way include Doug Barnes, Buddy Bradley, Monica Crowley, Bob Golden, Nancy Gutman, Peter Krause, Joan Landy, Guy Lawley, Barbara Lipsky, Peter Lauber, Helen Roberts, William Shea, and Chris Toulouse. Over a period of many years, Paul Bull has showered me with a stream of letters that are full of insight and kindly advice. His approach has always been extremely encouraging, and I wish to thank Paul Bull for it. Paul Bull also wrote the other big biography on James, and I have his chapter on the period of James's life when he was in America working with the Johnson Forest Tendency. I don't have like the entire book though. I don't know why necessarily, but I felt like this book was the better book to read, like from back start to finish, for research on James, because James is important to my master's research, which is on the Russian question in Trotskyism. I've learned a great deal from Scott McLemmie. He has conducted extensive research in the relevant archives and has come up with some magnificent sources, both primary and secondary, that I draw upon freely in this study. I await a thematic study of James with eager anticipation. Carrie Fraser offered characteristically astute comments on Chapter 6. Glenn Perusek helped me to think through some of the more difficult issues raised by the question of James' stance vis-a-vis the Western canon. Heather Catu of the Department of History at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Lisa Lindsay of CUNY Graduate Center, both provided useful research assistance in an efficient and timely manner, and Jim Murray, director of the C.L.R. James Institute in New York City, has provided active and ever helpful assistance in matters both editorial and archival. In this book, I draw on conversations I was fortunate to have with C.L.R. James in 1981, Lloyd Best, 1992, Robin Blackburn, 1992, Martin Glaberman, 1980, Phyllis and Julius Jacobson, 1992, George Rawwick, 1980 and 1987, B.J. Wittick, 1993, Steve Zelluck, 1984, as well as a correspondence with Hal Draper between 1980 and 1982. On my behalf, Heather Catu conducted an informative interview with Cyril Alston, a cousin and childhood friend of C.L.R. James, and also consulted the archives of the Oil Workers Trade Union in San Fernando. At different stages in the development of this manuscript, I benefited enormously from the editorial guidance of Lisa Hallgard, A.P. Simmons, David Terrien, or Terrien. Joan Ransdell did a superlative job as an indexer. Finally, there was one person, Jennifer Scarlett, who not only offered incisive comments on the manuscript, but lived through its lengthy gestation period. The book is dedicated to her. There's a quote here that says, quote, "Times would pass, old empires would fall, and new ones take their place. The relations of countries and the relations of classes had to change before I discovered that it is not quality of goods and utility which matter, but movement, but not where you are, but what you have. Not where you are, what you have, but where you have come from, where you are going, and the rate at which you are getting there. End quote. Beyond a boundary. Oh, okay. So this is a picture from of C.L.R. James's tombstone. His gravesite in Tunapuna, Trinidad. The photo was taken by Kent Worcester in 1992. Introduction. By any measure, C.L.R. James, Cyril Lionel Robert James, enjoyed an extraordinary career as a writer, theorist, polemicist, and revolutionary activist, a major but neglected intellectual figure of the 20th century. C.L.R. James has been described as, quote, the sharpest and most interesting mind that the British Caribbean has produced in 3 centuries of learning, end quote. Let me duplicate this page so I can get to these notes. What page did they say that was on? 245, let's say 260, maybe it's at. All right. Okay, here we are. Notes. Okay, so footnote. James Lamming, The Pleasures of Exile. Published originally in 1960. Pleasures of Exile by George Lamming is released with Pluto Press. Trying to find a description of it. In The Pleasures of Exile, as in his other works, George Lamming embraces the intricate issue of colonization and decolonization with a canny combination of playfulness and seriousness, irony and commitment. Quote, it is a reciprocal process, end quote. Lamming observes, quote, to be a colonial is to be a man in a certain relation, and this relation is an example of exile, end quote. Through a series of interrelated essays, The Pleasure of Exile explores the cultural, politics, and relationships created in the crucible of colonization. Drawing on Shakespeare's The Tempest and C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, as well as his own fiction and poetry, George Lamming deftly locates the reader in a specific intellectual and cultural domain, while conjuring a rich and varied spectrum of physical, intellectual, psychological, and cultural responses to colonialism. Quote, my subject, he writes, quote, is the migration of the West Indian writer as colonial and exile from his native kingdom, once inhabited by Caliban, to the tempestuous island of Prosperos and his language. This book is a report on one man's way of seeing, end quote. George Lamming. Back to the text and footnote. A product of the schools, playing fields, and literary subculture of colonial Trinidad, James went on to become an influential strategist of Pan-African politics and a sophisticated proponent of a heterodox and critical Marxism. By the 1960s, James was an elder radical statesperson on several continents, famous for his writing and historical impact. Yet for many years, James worked in obscurity, adopting pseudonyms and struggling, almost always with the help of others, to pay the rent. Fame was never his goal, nor money or a nice house. James' interests were intellectual and political, and also historical, in that James sought to understand and to have an impact on the underlying forces shaping modern society. There are many dimensions to James's life. Born at the turn of the century in a small town in Trinidad, James spent many years residing in New York, London, and other first world cities. Having imbibed a first-rate classical education, James defended B-movies, comic strips, and radio plays, and wrote lengthy documents pertaining to issues of revolutionary strategy and engagement. As a Marxist, James had one foot in the old left and one foot in the new, advancing the political autonomy of women, blacks, and young people at the same time that he insisted on the centrality of the industrial working class in the transition to socialism. A self-described Pan-Africanist, he maintained a cool distance from nationalist and communalist doctrines and defended Western literary and philosophical canons. While James practically embodied the idea of the, quote, man of letters, James often scorned the work of his peers and openly rejected the category of, quote, intellectual. Furthermore, while generally disdainful of electoral politics, James helped formulate the political program of the People's National Movement in the late 1950s and created a Trinidadian electoral vehicle, the Workers' and Farmers' Party, in the mid-1960s. According to Wikipedia, the Workers' and Farmers' Party was a Marxist political party in Trinidad and Tobago. The Workers' and Farmers' Party was organized by former Democratic Labour Party leader Stephen Maharaj, C.L.R. James, George Weeks of the Oil Fields Workers' Trade Union, and included the then little-known Basdeo Panday among its slate of candidates. It was succeeded by the United Labour Front led by Basdeo Panday. The party contested the 1966 general elections. The Workers' and Farmers' Party secured 3.5% of the vote and failed to win any seats in Parliament. None of the Workers' and Farmers' Party candidates secured the 12.5% of the vote in their constituency that was required to have their deposits refunded. The major political impact of the Workers' and Farmers' Party was that it launched the political career of Basdeo Panday. Back to the text. Sorry, I had to get a swig there. I had to swig it up. James's mature political vision, which evolved through a sustained encounter with the ideas of Hegel, Marx, and Lenin, exhibited considerable continuity with his youthful sensibility, which was modern, artistic, and democratic in character. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of James's life was his purposeful creativity. As an essayist, historian, literary critic, and pamphleteer, major works include Mint Alley, a novel, The Black Jacobins, Toussaint L'Ouverture and the San Domingo Revolution, a justly famous historical study, the article The Revolutionary Answer to the Negro Problem in the USA, a subtle Marxist polemic, American Civilization, an investigation of the connection between popular culture and democratic politics in American history, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, a work of literary criticism, and Beyond a Boundary, an evocative study of the impact of cricket on Caribbean society. Where am I? Diverse in subject matter and tone, these books and essays share in common a beautiful appreciation of the English language, as well as a learned and articulate populism. These writings also constitute only a small portion of a largely unexplored canvas. James wrote on dialectics, modern art, the slave trade, the city-state, the rise and fall of the Communist International, Shakespeare's stagecraft, Aristotle's poetics, existentialism and alienation, contemporary African politics, the Rastafari, the West Indian nation, the history of Pan-Africanism, the future of the novel, and a host of other topics. As this list makes clear, James was a prolific, eclectic writer whose work was driven by an innate curiosity and a rare sense of political determination. James's entire corpus betrays the mark of a singular intellect, one that was concerned above all with the power of reason and especially with the inventive potential of the masses engaged in social movement. Moreover, and in large measure through his writings as well as through speeches and other activities, James made a special contribution to the construction of a post-colonial West Indian identity. An early critic of colonialism, James argued strenuously in favor of a political and economic federation of the West Indies, and also actively promoted indigenous cultural forms, such as calypso and other types of popular music, as expressions of a West Indian nation in the process of formation. James's forays into fiction, which largely date from the 1920s, and which were produced in the context of a flourishing, politically engaged literary subculture, marked James as a major figure in the development of Caribbean literature and letters. Thus, while only a handful of organizations or publications in the region can meaningfully claim to be, quote, Jamesian in inspiration, his broad legacy continues to shape the work of intellectuals, writers, and others in the Anglophone Caribbean. By combining a concern for the autonomy of culture with an active pursuit of the social revolution, James helped carve out a bold identity for Caribbean artists and intellectuals, one that draws on European ideals even as it condemns the imperial project. James's legacy also signals a willingness to move beyond conventional conceptions of liberal democracy and to try and open up the political process in countries like Trinidad and Tobago to new kinds of institutions and new forms of civic participation. James was able to play an important role in the deepening of the anti-colonial project, not only in the Caribbean but across the entire African diaspora. This can be seen in his work with the International African Service Bureau, a London-based organization formed in the mid-1930s that agitated on behalf of African national independence and exerted a tremendous influence on post-war movements for decolonization. According to Wikipedia, the International African Service Bureau was a pan-African organization founded in London in 1937 by West Indians George Padmore, C.L.R. James, Amy Ashwood Garvey, T. Ras McConan, and Kenyan nationalist Jomo Kenyatta, and Sierra Leonean labor activist and agitator Ita Wallace Johnson. Chris Braithwaite, also known as Jones, was secretary of this organization. The Bureau emerged from the International African Friends of Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and intended to address issues relating to Africa and the African diaspora to the British general public, similar in design and organization to the West African Youth League. The International African Service Bureau also sought to inform the public about the grievances faced by those in colonial Africa and create a list of desired reforms and freedoms that would help the colonies. The International African Service Bureau also hoped to encourage new African trade unions to affiliate themselves with the British labor movement. To further its interests, the International African Service Bureau held weekly meetings at Hyde Park and where members discussed labor strikes in the Caribbean and Ethiopia. The International African Service Bureau supplied speakers to branches of the Labour Party, trade unions, and the League of Nations Union, and provided questions to be asked in front of Parliament regarding legislation, working conditions, and trade union regulations. The International African Service Bureau journal, International African Opinion, was edited by C.L.R. James. In 1939, the International African Service Bureau worked alongside the League of Colored Peoples and the West African Students' Union to campaign against the color bar introduced by Adjutant General Robert Gordon Finlayson in the British Army. The International African Service Bureau lasted until about 1945. Back to the text. James's dispensation was also manifest in his work in the 1940s in rethinking the political significance of African American struggles for social equality. During what might be termed the, quote, third wave of Black diasporic mobilization in the 1960s and early 1970s, James defined himself primarily as a teacher. James calls for new forms of pan-regionalism and participatory socialism in the Third World, went largely unheeded, however. Yet, through his friendships with such notable figures as George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Richard Wright, and others, James was able to forge a space for his idiosyncratic brand of radical and democratic politics within the context of Pan-African and Black nationalist movements. James's politics were forged in the crucible of classical Marxism, and in many respects James's life and work can only be understood with reference to his lifelong attachment to Marxist principles. Raised in a disorderly political culture that seemingly attached equal value to the incompatible ideals of late Victorian Romanticism, Marcus Garvey, and trade union activism, James underwent an ideological conversion in the early 1930s when James embraced Trotsky's left opposition and declared himself an anti-Stalinist and a revolutionary socialist. It was as a Trotskyist that James penned some of his best-known writings, addressing fundamental questions facing the international revolutionary movement. These included the nature of revolutionary leadership, the degeneration of the Russian Revolution, and the linkage between the movements in the Third World in general, and the African diaspora in particular, to struggles in the advanced industrial world. And it was as a disaffected post-Trotskyist that James began working with a small circle of friends and comrades to develop an alternative Marxism suited to the post-war era. The characteristic approach of this circle was to stress the independent capacity of subaltern groups to defend their collective interest and move society in a more cooperative direction. This circle, the so-called Johnson Forest tendency, rejected the notion of building a revolutionary vanguard party and concentrated instead on publishing newspapers and pamphlets that celebrated the political and social creativity of the masses. It was as a leader of the Johnson Forest tendency and its successor organizations that James came to terms with the theoretical underpinnings of Marxism and carved out a political niche for himself. While the tendency's polemics reached only a relatively small number of individuals, their anti-bureaucratic and, quote, pro-autonomy, end quote, thematic helped demarcate the distinctive vision of the early New Left. In many respects, however, James went further than his North American collaborators, weaving their unique problematic into a spirited analysis of literary and popular culture. His overarching thesis concerned the centrality of the mass audience in the construction of both classical drama and contemporary popular culture. In the 1950s, James started work on a book on Shakespeare's tragedies that was intended to highlight the special role of the audience and the entire theatrical performance in nourishing the bard's craft. In this period, James also explored the foundations of literary criticism and closely studied ancient Greek civilization and wrote occasional pieces on various aspects of modernism and the arts. Much of this work emphasized the historical significance of culture as an independent force in society, while many of James's insights foreshadowed themes popularized by the new field of cultural studies. James is equally at home with the reproachful teachings of William Thackeray and Matthew Arnold, as with his beloved gangster and detective movies. As the brilliant 1954 essay titled Popular Art in the Cultural Tradition demonstrated, few critics were better placed to simultaneously defend Western canons and champion post-war popular culture. Throughout his life, this, quote, indigent and itinerant West Indian black Marxist historian, end quote, struck up friends with artists, athletes, journalists, musicians, scholars, and political activists. Footnote. See Edward Said. That quote is from Edward Said, Culture and Imperialism. Culture and Imperialism is a 1993 collection of thematically related essays by Palestinian-American academic Edward Said, tracing the connection between imperialism and culture. Throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, the essays expand the arguments of Orientalism to describe general patterns of relation between the modern metropolitan Western world and their overseas colonial territories. Back to the text. In combination with James's distinctive persona, at once decorous, reserved, amiable, and ironic, James's wide range of personal relationships and experiences helped to further distinguish James from his comrades in the socialist movement. In Trinidad in the 1920s, James fraternized with writers and sportsmen such as Leary Constantine, Albert Gomez, and Eric Williams. As a resident Brighton, he consorted with an eclectic mix of activists, from Amy Ashwood Garvey Marcus Garvey's first wife, and actor-singer Paul Robeson, to European social theorists like Daniel Gorin, Karl Korsch, and Boris Souverine. I I have pieces from all those people. I don't know if I have anything particularly actually from Gorin, but I have things about Gorin. It was also in this period that James renewed his connection with the great Pan-African organizer and his childhood friend, George Padmore. Just quickly, the James Padmore's introduction to James Padmore's Wikipedia says George Padmore lived from 1903 to 1959 and was a leading Pan-Africanist journalist and author. George Padmore left his native Trinidad in 1924 to study medicine in the United States, where he joined the Communist Party. From there, he moved to the Soviet Union, where he was active in the party and working on African independence movements. He also worked for the party in Germany, but left after the rise of Nazism in the 1930s. In 1935, the USSR made a decisive shift in foreign policy. Britain and France, colonial powers with colonies in Africa, were classified as, quote, democratic imperialisms, a lower priority than the category of, quote, fascist imperialist powers, in which Japan and Germany fell. This shift fell into direct contradiction with George Padmore's prioritization of African independence, as Germany and Japan had no colonies in Africa. Padmore broke instantly with the Kremlin, but continued to support socialism. George Padmore lived for a time in France before settling in London, England in 1934. Toward the end of George Padmore's life, George Padmore moved to Accra, Ghana, where he helped shape the politics of Kwame Nkrumah and the Convention People's Party. Back to the text. In 1939, James conducted a perceptive series of conversations with the banished Leon Trotsky in Mexico. Shortly thereafter, in the United States, he argued politics with James Baldwin, James Cannon, Ralph Ellison, Irving Howe, Max Shachtman, Meyer Shapiro, and other celebrated New York intellectuals. As leader of the Johnson Forest Tendency, James was immersed in a tiny political subculture, but the group functioned more like a pressure cooker than a fraternal order, and the unstable mixture tended to blow up from time to time. I would say it's pretty disrespectful to say he was the leader of the Johnson Forest Tendency. There's a reason the name's hyphenated. Relations proved less fraught with younger West Indian writers like Wilson Harris, George Lamming, and Andrew Salke, as well as with the singer Mighty Sparrow. By the late 1960s, James' list of correspondence read like a veritable who's who of the international left. Towards the end of his life, James came to know a number of younger writers, such as Ntozake Shange, Maya Angelou, and Alice Walker, as well as the tennis star Arthur Ashe, who interviewed James at length for his celebrated book on blacks and sport. These associations highlighted the diversity of the communities through which James moved. They underscore the fact that there is no single political or social culture that can meaningfully claim James' undivided loyalty. No one problematic, Marxism, black nationalism, West Indian history and culture, and so on, can be used by itself to explain the totality of his life and work. His personal development and intellectual contributions are complex and multifaceted, and I have endeavored throughout this book to accentuate rather than occlude their complexity. New section. A number of recent initiatives have made it easier for the general reader to gain access to a broad swath of James's writings on Pan-Africanism, Marxism, the Caribbean, and culture. It is hoped that in tandem with these initiatives, this study and others will encourage readers to explore James's writings for themselves. In the interest of imparting a sense of Jones' own inimitable writing style and personality, I've quoted liberally from a wide array of published and unpublished sources. If these quotations, and the study as a whole, help to suggest the power and imagination of its subjects' labors, then the effort has been worthwhile. The organization of the book is as follows. The first chapter examines James's childhood and young adult life in Trinidad. with special reference to his intellectual, political, and literary development. The second chapter concerns his activities in England in the 1930s, paying particular attention to his transformation from humanist and novelist to socialist and revolutionary activist. The third and fourth chapters explore his American sojourn and his emergence as an original Marxian thinker. The third chapter focuses in particular on the issue of African American politics. Chapter 5 covers the period from 1953 to 1958, when James was living in London. Chapter 6 reviews James' participation in Trinidad's movement towards independence. The final chapter examines the years subsequent to 1962, when the eminence grise of Caribbean letters attained some measure of literary and academic respectability. Three appendices offer a list of abbreviations used throughout the book, short biographies of over 40 of James' associates, and a guide to the secondary literature.